Hi again. In this video, we're going to talk about type 1 and 2 errors. So this is when we're doing a hypothesis test. We might do the whole procedure correctly, but there's still an element of chance where we might not make the right decision. Okay, so this is not the type of error where we make a mistake during the test and we have a typo or calculate something wrong. This is even if we do the statistical process correctly, we might not make the correct decision, right? Because there's this element of chance and we don't know what the real answer is. That's why we're doing statistics in the first place, okay? But these, because we're doing, this is all based on sample to sample variation, there's still that chance, of error. So best example of this that most folks are familiar with is a medical test, okay? A COVID test, a pregnancy test, other types of medical tests. The null is always negative, right? We're generally assuming someone does not have a thing medically, and then the claim is that it's positive. So for example, a COVID test, assuming it's negative, but then the claim would be it's positive, okay? It's showing evidence that it's positive. Okay, so let's examine this, and I'm going to use this even when it's not a medical test. I always write out the null is negative and the claim is positive, and that helps me remember which is which. Okay, so if that works for you, that's great. Or you might find a different way that works for you. So let me show you what these mean. So over in the rows in this table, we reject the null and we fail to reject the null. So this is the results of the test. Okay, and then in the columns, we have what's happening in real life. Okay, so either the null is really true or the null is not really true. Okay, so let's see, we've got 4 different possibilities here. Okay. In the first one, we reject the null, but the null is really true. So we've rejected the null, so we've concluded positive, but the null really is true. Okay, so this is called a type 1 error. Whoops, sorry. And it's also called a false positive. Okay, we rejected the null, so we concluded there was evidence that it was positive, but the null was really true. The person really was negative. So this is a false positive, okay? Next case over to the right, if we reject the null and the null is not really true, that's not an error, right? We've correctly said the person is positive, so that is no error. Okay. Let's go to the next row. We fail to reject the null. Okay, so we're siding with the null. This also feels tricky because there's so many double negatives, right? We fail to reject the null, so I always have to think, okay, yeah, we're siding with the null. Okay, and the null is really true. That is also not an error. We side for the null's really true. Great, no problem. However, if we fail to reject the null, so now I've got 2 double negatives here. We fail to reject the null, so that means I'm siding with the null, but the null is not really true. Then we've said the person is negative. So this is a false negative. And that's called a type 2 error. Okay, so in my mind, the way I remember this is I remember a type 1 is a false positive and a type 2 is a false negative. So I just kind of remember false positive comes first, that's a type 1, false negative comes second, that's a type 2. Okay, now the other interesting thing is we never know if we're making these errors, right? We don't know what's true in real life. That's why we're doing the test in the first place. Okay, so there's always a possibility, and that's why we have, a certain alpha, we have a certain confidence level. We don't actually know what's happening, right? For medical tests, they'd have to use some other type of test to determine so that they would be able to find, do a bunch of trials and find the false positive or false negative rate. For example, I think lots of folks know that when you take a COVID test, there's a high home test. There's a high false negative rate, right? So that's why you have to keep testing a few times, especially, you might be more likely to test positive further down when you have more symptoms. However, there's a very small false positive, right? Most, you get that positive test, you're like, I'm positive. So they would have to do another type of test, like a PCR test, in order to get that false negative rate or false positive rate. Okay, so let's write this out in words. What does a type 1 error mean? What does a type 2 error mean? Okay, so type 1 error is a false positive. So that means we conclude for the alternate. Okay, and this is kind of my process whenever I'm doing these problems. Type 1 is false positive, so we conclude for the claim, the alternate. We conclude the alternate is true. But it's actually not. Okay, and remember, we always talk about evidence. We conclude we have evidence for the alternate, but it's actually not true. Okay, type 2 is a false negative. So with that, I say we conclude the null is true. But it's actually not true. Okay, so that's my how I go about it, and then I just put in the context here, whatever the alternate is, whatever the null is. Okay. Now there's a slightly different way to think about it, which you're welcome to tune it out if you don't want to hear it. But some people prefer. I'm going to make a kind of box over here that a type 1 is rejecting the null incorrectly. Okay, so we reject the null, but that was incorrect. And then type 2 is fail. Reject the null incorrectly. Okay, that one does not work as well for my brain, so I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but if you like that and want to explore that method, try that out. Okay, it's really about each person remembering, finding a way that works for yourself. Okay, so let's do a couple examples, okay? And I would encourage you to write these out first. This is a really good one to try testing your knowledge first. Try writing it out. You can pause the video, but let me read the example first, okay? So, example, write out the hypotheses and determine what a type 1 and type 2 error would be in this situation. Okay, then we also want to think, what are the possible consequences of each error type, and which one do you think is worse? Okay, so this is also really important in our setting up a test, is which error type is worse. Okay, so let's do, A is a pregnancy test. So a person tests to see if they're pregnant. So let's write out the null. Again, I'm going to write negative and positive, or I'm going to write hold on, am I doing not pregnant, or am I doing test to see if they're pregnant? Okay, so since we're testing to see if they're pregnant, so we're going to assume that they're not pregnant. The claim, or what the test would show evidence of, is that they are pregnant, okay? And I could, in my mind, use the same negative and positive language there, okay? So this is where it's a good idea to pause the video and try writing out what's a type 1 and what's a type 2. Okay, I mean it. Okay, type 1. So Type 1, false positive, we conclude for the alternate. Let me move this up. We conclude for the alternate. We conclude the person is pregnant. Or we could say the test concludes, either way. Concludes the person is pregnant, but they are not. Okay, I'm going to leave a little space there, and then I'm going to write type 2 because I want to leave space for the consequences. Type 2 is a false negative, so the test concludes they are not pregnant. Test concludes they are not pregnant, but they are. Okay, so let's think about which one of these is worse. Okay, so test concludes a person is pregnant, but they're not. What are the consequences of that? Well, they're thinking they are pregnant, so but then, at some point they're going to find out, well, first of all, there might be distress. It totally depends on a person's situation, right? If they want to be or not. So there could be emotional distress. Acting as if they're pregnant, right? So, maybe going to appointments, taking vitamins, all the things. To unneeded appointments. Okay. Eventually they'll find out, right? And then what about a type 2? The test concludes they're not pregnant, but they really are. Okay, so the person doesn't know they're pregnant. So maybe they are drinking and smoking or doing things that they wouldn't do if they knew, right? They also could be getting prenatal care. So could be smoking. Drinking or eating the things you're not supposed to eat, not getting care. Right, so eventually in both situations you'll find out the truth, which also would be distressing, right? But we're talking about what's the immediate result of the error. Okay, so which one do you think is worse overall? And they can both be bad for sure. However, I think what most folks say, and in terms of a public health perspective, personally you could disagree with this because it is a judgment call, but from a public health perspective, I think type 2 is worse when this could be harming an infant, okay, harming a growing baby. Okay, so often people say this one is worse, but again, it is a judgment call. Yeah, it is an opinion. Okay, so we're just trying to kind of estimate, and we're going to make our alpha go in a certain direction based on what happens here. Okay. Okay, so one more example. Try this one out. A person is on trial for theft. Okay. So different situation. The null. Our criminal justice system is far from perfect. It's a lot of issues there. But it is also a useful analogy to use for this, like the null being not guilty. Right? In a perfect system, everyone's presumed to be not guilty. And then you have to show evidence that they are guilty. Okay. Okay, so let's look at a type 1 and type 2 for this one. Now you can pause it. We're going to do the same thing and see which one is worse. Okay, so type 1, false positive. That means the person's concluded to be guilty, but they're not, right? Okay. My video just blacked out for a second, so I wasn't sure what was going on there. It came back. The person is found guilty, but they didn't do it. Didn't steal. Okay, so that's a false positive. Okay, I'm going to leave a little space to write the consequences of that. Type 2, move this up. So in a type 2, that's a false negative. They're found not guilty. But they did steal. Okay, so consequences of these. Found guilty, but they didn't steal. So this is, you know, an innocent person that's been convicted. Right, so it could be jail, fine, whatever, it's on their record. Okay, not good. What if someone's found not guilty, but they did steal? So then someone who did, you know, crime has gone free, right? Someone who did the crime has gone free. Right? There's no justice. They might keep doing it. Okay? Okay, so in your mind, which one is worse? Okay, I think a lot of people say that an innocent person being punished is worse than a guilty person going free. Okay, obviously it might depend on the type of crime, but I think that's the general consensus, is that a type 1 is worse. So I wanted to give you an example of this going both ways, where with the pregnancy test, a type 2 is generally considered to be the worse type of error, but in a court situation, type 1 is generally found to be the worst type of error. Okay, so how do we deal with this? So we need to learn a little bit more about alpha and how that works. So we'll explore that in the next video. Okay, I'll see you there.